I still remember the sound of the champagne popping. The smell of lemon butter and char-grilled salmon filled the banquet hall. Our servers, some of whom had been with us for over a decade, moved between the round tables like clockwork. The walls were decorated with framed photos. Opening day, the first feature in Bon Appetit, our third location ribbon cutting. It was our 25th anniversary. A quarter century of Sorella, the family restaurant I had poured my entire adult life into. We were celebrating at a hotel ballroom in Chicago, where our original restaurant had opened its doors back in 1999. I had just turned 36. I'd been running the business since I was 26, stepping in after my father's heart attack. At first, they just needed someone to keep the doors open. But I stayed, grew it, scaled it, and built Sorella into something bigger than any of them had imagined. So when my Uncle Frank tapped his fork against a wine glass and stood to give a speech, I assumed I knew what was coming. A tribute to my father. Maybe a few kind words about me. Instead, he turned to my cousin David. "I just want to take a moment," he said, smiling proudly, "to recognize someone who's shown incredible promise. Someone who truly understands what Sorella means to this family. The future of this brand. The person I believe will lead us into the next 25 years. My son, David." There was a pause, then clapping. I looked around the room. The applause spread quickly. My aunt, my cousins, two of the investors I had brought in years ago. Even the lawyer we hired last year to oversee the Arizona location stood and raised a glass. I just blinked. David smiled awkwardly, like he hadn't known it was coming. But I knew better. His modesty was too well rehearsed. I forced a smile and took a sip of my drink, the bitterness cutting sharper than the alcohol. The kind of smile you wear when you're surrounded by people who just voted you out of your own story and didn't even have the decency to warn you first. I found an excuse to step outside, claiming I needed to take a call. In reality, I just needed to breathe. For 10 years, I had sacrificed everything. Nights, weekends, relationships. I skipped birthdays, gave up 2 job offers from national chains, and cashed out my 401k to help open the second location. It was my strategy that got us into the airport food court contract. My late nights that landed us a glowing write-up in Food and Wine. My name on the credit applications when no one else would sign. David? He joined 2 years ago, worked part-time in marketing. He made a few flashy videos for TikTok, suggested a new logo, and showed up to one zoning meeting where he fell asleep halfway through. But he was Frank's son. And Frank, being my dad's older brother, still carried the illusion that he was the true patriarch of the brand. Later that night, I walked back into the ballroom. People were mingling, laughing. Someone had already ordered cake. I didn't confront anyone. I just smiled, posed for a few pictures. Let them believe I didn't care. Because they had no idea what they'd just done. I had learned the hard way that family and business don't always mix. That's why, 4 years ago, when we opened the franchise in Austin, I hired my own legal counsel and insisted on reviewing every operating contract personally. At the time, they thought I was paranoid, overly cautious. But it wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The next morning, I arrived at the flagship restaurant in River North at 6:45 a.m., before the rest of the team. I always did on Mondays. It gave me time to go through invoices and prep for the weekly operations call. At 7:30, Frank and David walked in. Their faces said everything. "Sophie," Frank started, not even looking guilty, "we've decided it's time for a transition. David will be stepping in as managing director." I didn't blink. I just folded my laptop shut, stood up, and looked at them both. "Okay," I said. "But you might want to double-check the franchise contracts before you get too comfortable." David frowned. "Why?" I grabbed my folder from the filing cabinet, pulled out a copy, and tapped the paragraph I had highlighted years ago. "Because if I'm removed from operational leadership without just cause," I said calmly, "those contracts are subject to immediate review and may be invalidated under the non-compete clause." Frank's face fell. David just stared. They had no idea, but they were about to find out. David stood frozen, the paper in his hands trembling slightly. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Frank leaned in to read over his shoulder, eyes narrowing as he skimmed the clause I had pointed to. Section 7.4, Leadership Clause. In the event of a leadership transition involving the removal or replacement of the operational director without cause, the franchise licensing agreement shall be subject to legal review, with full discretion granted to the original operational signatory. They hadn't read it. I could tell by their faces. They'd signed those documents when we launched the Austin and Denver locations, treating it like paperwork, not realizing the power they had handed me in the fine print. "You're bluffing," Frank said finally, his voice low and tight. I raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" I reached into my bag and handed him a second folder. "This is a legal summary prepared by the same attorney who reviewed all 4 of our franchise agreements. Her contact information is on the inside cover. Feel free to give her a call." David looked up, color draining from his face. "Wait, this clause gives you the right to suspend operations?" "If I'm removed without board approval and without written cause," I replied calmly, "which neither of you have." "You're not on the board," Frank snapped. "True," I said, "but I do control the franchise operations. You signed that over in 2019 when I personally invested in our expansion. You needed capital, remember? No bank would touch us without a proven operations executive." Frank went quiet. I could see the wheels spinning in his head, trying to recall every step he had taken. But the truth was, I had been one step ahead for years. I hadn't expected to need it. But I'd learned enough watching how decisions got made behind closed doors to know that if the day ever came, I needed to protect what I built. David looked like he was about to be sick. "So, what does this mean?" "It means," I said, "if you try to proceed with removing me, I have the legal authority to halt all franchise activity, pending litigation. That includes vendor agreements, supply chains, kitchen licensing, and employee contracts at every single franchise location." David opened his mouth, then shut it again. Frank was still glaring at me, like he couldn't quite believe this was happening. "You knew we might do this," he said quietly. I nodded. "I knew it was possible. Not because I thought you were evil, just careless, entitled. You've always treated Sorella like a family inheritance, but it wasn't handed to me. I earned every square inch of it." Frank let out a bitter laugh. "You think you're the only one who's worked hard for this family?" "No," I said evenly. "But I am the only one who turned a failing restaurant into a multi-million-dollar brand while the rest of you sat back and collected dividend checks." He took a step forward. "You don't want to start a war, Sophie?" I met his gaze. "Then don't start one." The silence stretched between us for a long moment. David looked from me to his father, then back again. "So, what now?" I took a breath. "Now, I suggest we do what we should have done in the first place. Talk to the board. Call an emergency meeting. Let them weigh in. But if either of you moves forward without due process, I'll file for injunctions this afternoon." Frank muttered something under his breath. "I'm not trying to burn this place down," I added, "but I'm not letting you erase me either." With that, I turned and walked out of the office, my pulse hammering in my ears. Once outside, I didn't go back to work. I got in my car and drove straight to my lawyer's office downtown. She had already read the room better than I had months ago when I'd asked her to double-check all operational clauses, just in case. "I had a feeling you'd be in today," she said, waving me into her office. "They actually did it," I said, sitting down. "They tried to replace me." She sighed and pulled out a legal pad. "Do you want to fight this quietly or publicly?" I hesitated, then said, "Let's start quiet. But be ready to go loud." I left her office with a signed affidavit in my bag and copies of all 4 franchise agreements in my hand. Back at the restaurant, the tension had already shifted. Staff were whispering. Our general manager, Luis, gave me a silent nod as I walked in. He had heard. The battle had officially begun. But what Frank and David didn't know? I wasn't just fighting to keep my job. I was fighting to protect everything I had built from the very people who thought they could steal it and get away with it. The following morning, I arrived at the restaurant before the sun rose. Not because I had to, because I needed to. I wanted to see who would show up, who would greet me like they always had, and who would avoid eye contact. In a family business, loyalty is rarely about performance. It's about blood. And I was about to find out just how much of that loyalty was real. Luis, our general manager, was already prepping the kitchen for the lunch shift. He looked up and gave me a half smile. "Morning, boss." I nodded. "Thanks for being here." He gave a small shrug. "This place only runs because of you. We all know that." I was grateful, but I didn't let it show. I was too used to people changing their minds the moment power shifted, so I kept my guard up. By 8 a.m., the whispers had begun. Word had gotten out. Frank and David had told a few department heads that I'd be stepping aside and that David would be taking over the transition, effective immediately. It wasn't a formal announcement, but it was enough to rattle people. And they had timed it well. Tuesday was our supplier meeting, where we usually reviewed monthly orders, new menu items, and expansion updates. This time, it felt more like a silent war zone. I walked into the meeting room to find a few longtime staff already seated. Maria from marketing, John from operations, and Elise, our finance director. David stood at the front, awkwardly shuffling papers like he had something important to say. Frank wasn't in the room, but his presence lingered in every stiffened back and averted gaze. David cleared his throat. "Before we get started, I just want to thank everyone for their ongoing commitment during this exciting new chapter." I sat down at the far end of the table, arms folded. David glanced at me but didn't meet my eyes. "As you've probably heard," he continued, "there's been a shift in leadership. Starting this week, I'll be overseeing daily operations." "According to who?" I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. The room froze. David hesitated. We made the decision as a family." "That's not how operational leadership is determined," I said. "There are franchise agreements, board approvals, legal processes, none of which have happened." David's face turned red. "Sophie, let's not make this uncomfortable." "You already did that," I said. Then I turned to the others in the room. "I've led this company for 10 years. Every expansion, every menu overhaul, every growth phase came from this table with your help. Now ask yourselves, do you really want to follow someone who's been in this business for 15 minutes just because his last name matches the sign out front?" Silence. Maria looked down at her notes. Elise shifted in her chair. No one defended David, but no one spoke up either. I stood. "This meeting is over." David's jaw clenched. "You can't just walk out." I smiled coldly. "Watch me." And I did. Back in my office, I sent 2 emails. One to our legal team, instructing them to notify the franchisees that no leadership change was authorized and that any communications from David or Frank were unofficial. The second, to the board. Subject: Emergency session request. Leadership challenge. I requested an emergency meeting. According to our bylaws, any board member with executive authority could call for one within 48 hours. I was within my rights, and I had documentation to back every move I made. But what I didn't have yet was certainty about where the board's loyalty lay. Frank had influence. He'd been one of the original co-founders. Some of the board members had known him for 20 years. And while they respected me, respect didn't always translate to votes. That evening, I called Luis again. "How bad is it?" I asked. There was a pause on the line. Then, "Half the staff are watching to see who wins. The other half are hoping you do." "And David?" "He's calling meetings, trying to win people over, talking about vision and fresh energy. But he's nervous. You can tell." I thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence. This wasn't just about titles anymore. It was about trust, influence, control. And tomorrow I'd have to fight not just for my job, but for the soul of the company I built. Because Frank and David weren't backing down. They were just getting started. 2 days later, I walked into the boardroom at 9 a.m., sharp. The air was colder than usual, heavy with pretense. The long mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the 12 leather chairs around it were all occupied, except for mine. I took my seat at the far end. Across from me sat Frank, flanked by David. David looked nervous. He should have. He was out of his depth, and deep down, he knew it. But Frank? He looked composed, smug, like a man confident he had the votes lined up before the game even started. One by one, the board members greeted me with professional courtesy. Neutral, cautious. No one smiled. Then Charles Mitchell, our board chair, cleared his throat. "I believe we all know why we're here," he said, his voice clipped. "There's been a dispute regarding the role of managing director." "Dispute," I repeated, almost under my breath. "That's one word for it." He ignored me. "Frank, since this request originated on your end, we'll begin with you." Frank stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He always did that before speaking, as if fabric could somehow lend authority. "First, let me say that we are deeply grateful for everything Sophie has done for Sorella. Her dedication is undeniable. But as we look ahead to the next 25 years, we believe new leadership is essential. Someone with fresh ideas, a stronger public presence, and the ability to modernize our brand." He gestured to David. "My son has been working closely with our marketing and social media teams for over a year. His recent campaign tripled engagement and brought in a younger demographic. This is the direction we need to go." I let him finish. Then I stood slowly. "Thank you, Frank," I said, my voice steady. "Now let's talk facts." I tapped the tablet in front of me, and the wall screen behind me lit up with data. Growth charts, revenue spikes, franchise expansion timelines. In the past 10 years, we've gone from one struggling restaurant to a 4-location franchise valued at over $5 million. That growth didn't happen because of viral Instagram posts. It happened because of operational strategy, risk management, vendor negotiations, and a team I personally built from the ground up. I turned to face the board. I didn't inherit this company. I rebuilt it. Every milestone you see on that screen, every contract, every renovation, every new hire, was approved and executed under my leadership. David shifted uncomfortably. He was starting to sweat. "But let's set all of that aside," I continued, "because this isn't about preference. It's about legality." I pulled up a second document. This is the franchise licensing agreement, signed in 2019 and updated in 2021. It clearly states that any change to operational leadership must be reviewed and approved by this board and accompanied by written cause. There was no review, and no cause. The room was silent. No one blinked. I know some of you are close with Frank. I respect that. But if you allow this kind of internal power grab, you're setting a precedent that undermines everything we've built. Then I paused, letting the next sentence land hard. "And if I walk today, every franchise agreement goes with me." Gasps weren't common in boardrooms, but I got one. Charles leaned forward. "You're saying you would revoke the licenses?" "I'm saying," I replied, "that you'd be left with 4 properties, no operational continuity, no management infrastructure, and, most critically, no brand." Frank jumped in. "This is extortion. This is business," I said calmly. "The kind you forgot how to do a long time ago." Charles cleared his throat again. "Let's move to a vote." Frank looked smug again. Too smug. That's when I knew. He'd gotten to someone. The votes came in, one by one. 4 for David, 3 for me, 2 abstained, 1 left. All eyes turned to Elise. She had always been neutral, finance first, non-confrontational. She looked at me, then at David, then down at her tablet. "I vote in favor of Sophie," she said. Frank shot up. "Elise." She cut him off. "Enough, Frank. I've worked under both of them. Only one of them knows what they're doing. Final tally, 5-4. I had won, barely. As I gathered my things, I looked at David. You didn't lose because you're young, I said softly. You lost because you tried to skip the part where you earn it. Then I looked at Frank. And you? You forgot who was keeping your name on the building. I walked out of the boardroom into a hallway that suddenly felt warmer, lighter. But I knew better than to celebrate, because men like Frank don't lose quietly. And David wasn't going to disappear. They were going to try again. Only next time, they'd come at me from the outside. The board vote was done. I had won. But the victory felt fragile, like glass that could shatter under pressure. I knew Frank wasn't going to walk away with his pride bruised and his son publicly humiliated. That wasn't who he was. And I didn't have to wait long to find out exactly what he was planning next. 2 days later, the first article dropped. Leadership rift at Sorella. Sources say founder's daughter refused to step aside. The headline hit local business blogs first. Then it crept into national restaurant publications. The article was filled with vague, insider sources and cleverly phrased half-truths. It painted me as a power-hungry control freak, unwilling to embrace modern leadership or share credit with the next generation. There was no mention of the board vote, no mention of the contracts, no mention of the 10 years I spent rebuilding this company from the ground up. Just quotes like, "Some say she runs the business like a dictatorship." Others believe the brand needs a younger, more innovative voice. I stared at the screen, fists clenched on my desk. Frank was doing what he did best, reframing reality. And this time, he had help. Within hours, investors started calling. A few politely asked for clarification. Others weren't so polite. Should we be concerned about leadership instability? Is this why expansion into San Diego stalled? Is it true you refused to hire a chief marketing officer because you felt threatened? I took a deep breath before answering each one. Calm, measured, factual. But inside, I was seething. That evening, Luis knocked on my office door and stepped in quietly. "Word is," he said, "Frank's been calling vendors, asking if they'd work with David directly, hinting at a restructure." I leaned back in my chair. Of course he has. And one more thing, Luis added hesitantly. A few of the newer staff at the flagship front of house called out sick today. Same ones David hired. Might not be a coincidence. It wasn't. It was a message. He couldn't beat me inside the system, so now he was trying to make me look like I couldn't control my own business. Undermine morale, disrupt daily operations, rattle the board, and worst of all, make me doubt myself. But what Frank didn't understand was that I'd spent a decade in crisis mode. I'd dealt with burst pipes during dinner service, 3 lawsuits, 2 kitchen fires, and a global pandemic. He wanted a public war? Fine. The next morning, I scheduled a press release. No denials, no counter-smears, just facts. Sorella is proud to confirm its leadership structure remains unchanged following a routine board vote, with Sophie Harper continuing in her role as managing director. Under her leadership, the brand has expanded into 4 markets and grown revenue by over 350% in 10 years. The board remains confident in her vision for the future. It was short, precise, unapologetic. Then I called in my own favor, an old friend who worked as a producer on a regional business show. 3 days later, I sat down in a TV studio across from a well-known anchor. He introduced me as the woman behind one of the Midwest's fastest-growing restaurant franchises. "I have to ask," he said, leaning in with a smile. "What's your secret?" I smiled back. Relentless hard work, strategic growth, and learning to tune out the noise. He laughed. "That sounds like a subtle nod to some of the recent headlines." I kept my voice steady. "If doing my job well makes me difficult, I can live with that." The interview aired that evening, and for the first time in weeks, the narrative shifted. Investors stopped calling. Customers sent messages of support. Our Instagram saw a surge of engagement, not because of David's youthful energy, but because people respect resilience. But not everyone was pleased. That night, I received a message from an anonymous number. "Enjoy the spotlight. You've made enemies." I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it. Not because I wasn't rattled, but because I knew fear was the whole point. This wasn't just about contracts or press coverage anymore. Frank and David wanted to break me. Publicly. Personally. But they were forgetting something. I'd already survived the hardest part. Building everything from nothing. Now, I was just protecting what was mine. And I wasn't done yet. Because I had one more move left. One that would remind them exactly who they were dealing with. 2 weeks after the board vote, the media firestorm, and the anonymous threats, the dust finally began to settle. But I hadn't. I was still working 16-hour days, still in my office before sunrise, still walking the kitchen line during dinner rush. But it wasn't fear driving me anymore. It was clarity. Because I knew that if I wanted peace, real peace, I had to do more than just survive Frank and David's betrayal. I had to close the door behind them. For good. And I knew exactly how to do it. It started with a call to Elise, our finance director, the same board member whose vote had saved me. "I want a full audit," I told her. "Quiet, internal. Go back 5 years." She didn't ask questions. She just nodded. "Got it." I had my suspicions. Little things I'd noticed over the years. Frank had always handled legacy accounts. The vendor contracts for our original Chicago suppliers had never been fully transitioned to my department. It was a gray area, one I had allowed out of respect. Loyalty. Now I knew better. 2 days later, Elise walked into my office holding a thick file. "I didn't think you were right," she said, "but you were." She dropped the folder on my desk. Inside, invoices, payment discrepancies, vendor kickbacks. Nothing explosive, but enough to show a clear pattern of self-dealing. Frank had been funneling a portion of the vendor rebates to a side company registered under his name. One that billed us for consulting. It wasn't illegal per se, but it was unethical, and a breach of our internal policy. And David? His name was on a few of the invoices too. I sat in silence for a moment, then slowly picked up the phone. "Elise," I said, still holding the file. "Notify the board. We're calling a vote for removal." "Just Frank?" she asked. I looked down at David's signature. "Both." 1 week later, we met again in the boardroom. Frank came in looking defiant. David looked exhausted. "I know what this is," Frank said before the meeting began. "This is personal." "No," I replied. "This is business. You taught me that, remember?" I handed out the documents. I didn't need a big speech. The numbers spoke for themselves. Vendor kickbacks, false reimbursements, misappropriated funds. David tried to explain. Said he just signed what his father gave him. That he didn't know. I believed him. But that didn't mean I was going to protect him. The vote was swift. 8-1. Effective immediately, Frank and David were removed from all positions and privileges within Sorella. Frank's shares were frozen pending investigation. David's severance was denied. It was done. But I wasn't finished. That weekend, I hosted a staff meeting. No press, no PR spin, just our full team, packed into the flagship location. "I want to tell you all something," I said, standing in front of the open kitchen. "This restaurant isn't mine because my name is Harper. It's mine because I showed up when no one else did. Because I worked the fryers when we were short-staffed and mopped the floors when our dishwasher quit mid-shift. I know many of you did the same. And we're still here. Together." I paused, looking at familiar faces. Servers who'd been with us since the second location. Cooks who had followed me across state lines. We're not just rebuilding a brand anymore. We're protecting a legacy. One built with sweat, not signatures. Applause erupted. Not polite, not forced, real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel since this all began: relief. A year later, Sorella crossed $10 million in revenue. We opened in 2 new cities, we launched a training program for women in culinary leadership. And the board? Rebuilt, transparent, accountable. Frank never reached out again. David sent a short email once. No apology, just a line that read, "You were right. I wasn't ready." I didn't respond, because closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from letting go of people who only show up when the credit rolls in. Now, when I walk through the original Chicago kitchen, I don't feel bitterness anymore. I feel pride. Not because I won, but because I stayed standing when everyone expected me to fold. Because I proved, not to them, but to myself, that strength isn't inherited. It's built, dish by dish, shift by shift, contract by contract. So the next time someone asks me how I kept my company from being stolen, I'll tell them this: I didn't fight to stay in power. I fought to protect what I created from people who thought they could claim it without earning it. And that's something I'll never be sorry for. My name is Mandy, and I was never the kind of person who cared about impressing others. At 34, I had everything I needed: a successful business, a beautiful home, and a life I built from the ground up. But sometimes I felt like I was still that 16-year-old girl sitting at a family dinner, trying to hide the sting of their sneers behind a smile. Tonight was supposed to be different. It was Thanksgiving, and for once I thought maybe this year would be the one where my family would finally see me for who I really was. Not just as the girl with the junk car, the one who worked too much, or the one who wasn't good enough in their eyes. As I pulled up to my parents' house in the old Toyota Corolla, I felt the familiar weight settle in my chest, the familiar pang of being looked down on. The car wasn't new. It was a 2008 model that had been with me through thick and thin. Reliable, sturdy, and practical, just like me. But to my family, it was just another reason to mock me. Another thing they could use to prove that I hadn't made it. I parked behind my cousin Alex's sleek black Porsche, and I could already hear the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from inside. The house, as always, was pristine, with its manicured lawn and perfect holiday decorations. The table would be set with silver cutlery and fine china, a setting designed to impress anyone who stepped foot in this place. But I knew that none of it would matter. Not to them. "Hi, Mandy." My mom greeted me with a polite smile when she opened the door, but I could see the judgment in her eyes as she looked past me, her gaze lingering on the car. "Hi, Mom," I said, stepping inside, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. Inside, the dinner was already in full swing. My cousins, aunts, and uncles were chatting around the grand table. I noticed Alex, the ever-confident cousin, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile as he talked about the latest real estate deal he'd made. Then there was Karen, the older cousin who never let a chance slip by to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. She was perched at the head of the table, talking loudly about her husband's new job at a prestigious law firm. "Still driving that junk, Mandy?" Karen's voice rang out, too loud, too deliberate. Everyone turned toward me. Her words cut through the noise like a knife, and I felt every pair of eyes on me. I smiled, the way I always did when I was uncomfortable. "It's reliable," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It gets me where I need to go." The room fell silent for a moment before Alex chimed in. "I mean, seriously, Mandy, how long are you going to hold on to that thing? You could afford something way better if you just let go of that old pride of yours." I could feel my cheeks burn, but I kept my cool. This was nothing new. It was their way of reminding me that I didn't fit in, that I wasn't one of them. The ones who were successful, who drove fancy cars and wore designer clothes. It was easy for them to forget that I had built my success from scratch, not inherited it or married into it. But what did it matter to them? "Well, maybe I like it this way," I said, taking my seat at the table, trying to deflect the sting of their words. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't just holding on to my old car out of stubbornness. I was trying to prove something they'd never understand. I had worked hard to get where I was, and the last thing I needed was their validation. Anyway, I said, changing the subject. How's everyone else doing? I took a sip of my wine, hoping to steer the conversation away from my car. But before anyone could answer, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at it briefly, but then quickly glanced up again, just in time to catch Karen rolling her eyes. "Always so busy, aren't you?" she said. "Maybe if you spent less time working and more time enjoying life, you wouldn't be so uptight." I opened the text message on my phone quickly. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the name on the screen. It was Jennifer, my assistant. She'd been with me since the beginning of my business, and she knew everything about me. Everything that mattered. "Your jet is ready, ma'am," the message read. I froze, my hand still gripping the wine glass. And for a moment, the world around me felt like it had slowed down. My gaze moved across the table, meeting each of my relatives' eyes. Their expressions shifted in a split second, from smug amusement to something far different. Shock, disbelief, and then curiosity. The noise around me seemed to fade, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart as I held up my phone. And without missing a beat, I read Jennifer's message aloud. "Your jet is ready, ma'am." The table went completely silent. The kind of silence that feels so thick, you can almost taste it. "Excuse me," I said quietly, setting down my wine glass. "I need to take this." As I stood up, every pair of eyes followed me. The familiar sneers were gone, replaced with a look I couldn't quite place. Sudden realization, maybe? Or was it fear? Either way, the tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. I stepped into the hallway, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Pride, defiance, but also a small twinge of regret. I hadn't meant to expose them like this, not in front of everyone. But I'd been carrying this weight for years, and tonight I wasn't going to hide it anymore. They could think what they wanted, but I wasn't the same person they'd always belittled. The sound of Jennifer's voice on the other end of the line brought me back to reality. "Everything's in place, Mandy. Just let me know when you're ready." I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar rush of power and control that had defined my success. Maybe tonight wasn't about impressing my family. Maybe it was just about showing them the truth. With a sigh, I turned and headed back into the dining room, my eyes meeting each of their gazes, knowing that things would never be the same after tonight. I walked back into the dining room, my footsteps slow, deliberate, as though the weight of the moment was pressing down on me with every step. The silence around me was unnerving, the kind of silence that says everything without a single word being spoken. The family, once bustling with their usual chatter, now sat frozen. Their glasses, filled to the brim with wine, remained untouched. The clink of silverware against fine china had ceased. All eyes were on me. I stood there for a moment, surveying the room, taking in the stunned faces. Alex, the cousin who'd mocked me the most, looked as though someone had slapped him across the face. His usual confident smirk was nowhere to be found, replaced with wide, startled eyes. Karen's mouth hung open slightly, her perfectly painted lips frozen in surprise. My parents, well, they had the look of people who had just been blindsided by a force they never saw coming. It was a feeling I was getting used to, watching them react as if they had no idea who I really was. I cleared my throat, the weight of their stares making my palms sweat. "Sorry, Jennifer's just confirming the final details," I said, my voice steady, but my heart pounded in my chest. I could feel my mother's eyes boring into me, her gaze heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Disappointment? Guilt? Or perhaps, in that moment, a realization of just how far she had underestimated me. "Jet?" My father finally spoke, his voice sounding almost foreign, as if the words had gotten caught in his throat. "What do you mean, jet?" I could hear the disbelief in his tone and the irritation that followed. My father was a businessman, a successful one by all accounts, but he'd built his success the traditional way, through years of hard work, managing investments, and climbing the corporate ladder. To him, wealth was meant to be worn and displayed like a trophy. The idea of quietly amassing millions in a way that was invisible to others was something he simply couldn't comprehend. "It's just something I've been working on," I said, my words careful but firm. "I built my company from the ground up. It's not about flaunting my success. It's about what I've done, not what I've got." The room shifted. It wasn't a dramatic shift. No one jumped up, no one shouted, but the air seemed to crackle with the tension. The collective realization that the quiet little cousin they'd mocked all these years had done something they never thought possible. "I think you should have told us sooner," my father muttered, his voice low, more to himself than to me. "We could have helped you. We could have—" "No," I interrupted, the word leaving my mouth sharper than I intended. "I didn't need your help. I didn't ask for it. This was my choice." I looked around the table, taking in their faces, their confusion, their surprise. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, no longer the confident, cutting cousin I had always known. She looked smaller somehow, unsure of herself, as though the very foundation of her superiority had been shaken. "Look, Mandy." Alex finally spoke, his voice tentative, almost pleading. "I didn't mean anything by it. You know, the car. It's hard to understand why you'd choose to live like this when you could be living, well, like us." I could feel the familiar burn of resentment rising in my chest, but I swallowed it down. Now wasn't the time for that. "You don't get it, Alex. You don't get why I do what I do. I don't need the newest car or the biggest house to feel validated. I don't need the trophies. I don't need your approval." Aunt Denise's voice cut in then, sharp and judgmental as always. "It's a bit late for this whole humble act, don't you think? If you're going to live this life, why not just admit it? Why the secrecy? All these years and you never once thought to mention it?" I felt the sting of her words, but I didn't flinch. I didn't want to be seen as a success because of my possessions, Aunt Denise. I wanted to be seen for who I really am. Not the car I drive, not the clothes I wear, not the house I live in. The table fell quiet again. Even Aunt Denise seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. My mother, sitting at the head of the table, had her hands folded neatly in her lap. She said nothing, but her eyes were locked on me, her face a picture of something between disbelief and regret. I couldn't hold back the frustration any longer. "You all acted like I was invisible. You laughed at me behind my back. You treated me like I was lesser. I've been sitting here for years, hoping that one day you'd see me for who I am, but it's always been about what I have, not who I am." Alex opened his mouth as if to speak, but closed it again. No one knew what to say. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating almost, as though the silence was pressing in from all sides. They hadn't known this side of me. They hadn't known what I was capable of. To them, I was still that girl with the junk car and the silly little business, not the woman who had built a multi-million-dollar company from scratch. Finally, it was my grandmother, Ruth, who spoke. She had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table, watching everything unfold with a kind of knowing calm. "I've always known you were special, Mandy," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You don't need their approval to be great. You never did." The sincerity in her words almost broke me. Grandma Ruth had always been the one person in this family who truly understood me. She never judged me. She never looked down on me for my choices. It was then that I realized something profound. I had nothing to prove to them anymore. They had spent years looking down on me, assuming I was insignificant, that I didn't belong in their world. But here I was, and they had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. For a brief moment, I thought about the future, how things would change from this point on. There was no going back to the way things were. I had to wonder, though, if they would ever truly accept me for who I was, or if the approval they offered now was simply a reflection of my success, not of me as a person. But whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let them define me anymore. Not now. Not ever again. The tension at the dinner table hadn't fully dissipated when I stood up, excusing myself with a vague, "I need a moment." I walked out of the dining room, my heart still hammering in my chest. I needed a breather, a moment to gather myself before the storm that was undoubtedly brewing in my absence. I didn't head for the bathroom, though. Instead, I made my way to the back of the house, stepping out onto the patio where the cool air hit my face, offering a temporary reprieve from the overwhelming emotions swirling inside me. My hands were shaking, but I took a deep breath and steadied myself. As I leaned against the railing, I let my thoughts drift. I hadn't expected that kind of reaction. Not from them. It was one thing to hear their disapproval, to feel their judgments, but seeing the look on their faces when I revealed my success, it was something else entirely. I glanced out at the horizon, trying to calm the storm inside me. There was no denying it anymore. I had changed. I wasn't the girl they all used to put down, and I had worked too hard to get here to allow their perceptions of me to hold any weight. The sound of footsteps behind me interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see my father standing at the door, his face softening as he approached. He was trying, I could tell, but he still didn't quite know how to handle this. Not the way I needed him to. "Mandy," he started, his voice hesitant. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't know." I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't know what, Dad? That I wasn't a failure?" "No, He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't know it had gotten this far. You've always been so quiet about it. So humble." I almost laughed at that. Humble? That's how he saw me? As quiet, modest Mandy who never spoke up about her achievements because they didn't fit into the box he had created for me. "Dad," I said softly, "I didn't want to talk about it because I wanted you to see me for who I am, not for the things I own. I've been telling you all along, in my own way. But you never listened, did you? You only cared about what you could see." His expression faltered. I could see it. The realization that his perception of me, of my life, had been wrong all along. "I didn't mean to," he started, but I cut him off. "I know you didn't, Dad. But sometimes your actions speak louder than words. I've spent my whole life trying to earn your approval, but you never asked about what really mattered to me, about what I wanted to build. I don't need your validation anymore, not like I used to." There was a long pause before my father nodded slowly, as if processing everything I'd said. "I can't undo what I've done," he admitted, his voice low. "But I can try. For you." I was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. For the first time in my life, I saw him try to bridge the gap that had always existed between us. I didn't know if it was too little, too late. I didn't know if it would ever be enough. But part of me wanted to believe that this moment could be the beginning of something different between us. "I appreciate that, Dad. But it can't be about just fixing things for the sake of it. It has to be real." He nodded again. "I'll work on that, Mandy. I'll try to understand you more." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and smiled. A small, genuine smile. That's all I've ever wanted. As I turned to walk back inside, I noticed the other members of the family had gathered in the living room. Their expressions were a mixture of curiosity and awkwardness, unsure of how to proceed now that the reveal was over. It felt almost like a slow-motion train wreck, everyone waiting for the next move. I took another deep breath and walked in, my eyes meeting my cousin Alex's. The guilt was evident in his eyes, and I could see him struggling to find the right words. "Look, Mandy," he started, his voice careful. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier. I didn't know. I had no idea." I nodded, appreciating his attempt to make amends. "I get it, Alex. But understand this. What I drive, what I wear, None of that defines who I am. My worth isn't wrapped up in any of that, and neither should yours be." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt less charged, more contemplative. The family had been forced to acknowledge a reality they had spent years denying. They dismissed me, underestimated me, and written me off as someone who hadn't made it. Now, they had to face the truth of who I was and what I had accomplished. I turned to my mother, who had been eerily quiet since my announcement. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, looking almost fragile. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes staring at the floor as if searching for the right thing to say. "Mom," I said softly, "do you have anything to say?" She looked up, and for the first time that evening, I saw something resembling regret in her eyes. "I didn't know you felt so overlooked," she whispered. I thought you didn't want us to know. I thought it was your choice to keep it quiet." I walked over to her, sitting down beside her. "I've always wanted you to know, Mom. But I've also wanted you to see me for who I am, not for my title or my wealth. All I've ever wanted was to be accepted as I am." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know how to fix this. I wish I'd seen it sooner." "You don't need to fix it," I said gently. "Just try to be present. Try to understand." For a moment, everything was quiet again. The harshness of the past few years, of being misunderstood, underestimated, and pushed aside, felt like it was beginning to lift. But I knew the journey wasn't over. This was only the beginning. There would be more battles, more moments like this. But I was ready for them. Ready to stand my ground and be seen for who I truly was. The days following that Thanksgiving dinner were a whirlwind of emotions. The truth had been laid bare, and my family, once so confident in their assumptions about me, were now navigating the wreckage of their ignorance. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, unshaken by the judgments and expectations that had weighed me down for so long. But as much as I had hoped that my family would suddenly begin to understand me, I knew better. Change wasn't instant. It wasn't a magic switch that could be flipped. The process would be slow, and there would be setbacks. The first few days after the dinner, I received a handful of messages from my parents. Texts filled with half apologies and attempts to explain themselves. My father's message stood out. "I still don't understand why you kept it from us, but I'm proud of you, Mandy. Let's talk more soon." It wasn't the grand gesture I had hoped for, but it was a start. For once, I felt like I wasn't fighting an uphill battle on my own. I had been invisible to them for so long, and now, slowly, they were beginning to see me. But I wasn't naive enough to think this would be the end of it. I knew my father would continue to measure success by things like money, status, and power. That's how he had been raised. And that's how he had built his own empire. It was hard to erase a lifetime of that kind of thinking, but I couldn't help but hold on to hope that maybe, just maybe, he would see me for who I was, and not just as the daughter who had gone a different way. It was a few days later when I received a call from Jennifer. She was as calm and collected as ever, but there was an edge to her voice that I didn't quite like. "Mandy," she started, "I need to talk to you about something. It's important." The urgency in her voice made my stomach churn. "What is it?" I asked, already mentally bracing for whatever news she had to share. "I've been hearing things, from clients, from investors," she said, hesitating. "They know about your family, and they're starting to question your business practices, your connection to all that wealth." I paused, my thoughts racing. "Are you saying they think I'm just using my family's name to push my company forward?" Jennifer didn't respond right away, but I could hear the tension in the silence. "It's not that they think that directly, but they're starting to wonder if your success is tied to who you are, not just what you've built." I felt a sharp pang in my chest. It was as though everything I'd worked so hard to achieve, everything I'd fought for, was about to be overshadowed by the very thing I had spent so long trying to hide. My family's wealth, their status, their connections. It was like it was all suddenly being weaponized against me. I didn't want to tell you this, Jennifer continued, but I think it's time to have a conversation with the investors, with your team. I shook my head, frustration welling up inside me. I can't believe this. I've built this company from the ground up and now… I know, Jennifer interrupted gently. But you need to understand, Mandy. They don't care about the blood, sweat, and tears you've put in. They care about the image. And right now, the image isn't what we need. I leaned back in my chair, letting her words sink in. The very thing I had fought to distance myself from, my family's influence, was now threatening to unravel everything I'd worked so hard for. My heart raced as I processed what this meant for the future. The truth of who I was, the authenticity of my journey, seemed to be slipping away, just as the world around me demanded a version of success that fit their expectations. After a long pause, I spoke. What do you suggest? There's no easy way around this, Mandy. But we have to address it. We need to separate you from your family's wealth and connections, completely. It was a hard pill to swallow. I had always prided myself on staying true to who I was, on not letting my family's status define me. But now I was being asked to take another step, to disconnect myself from everything that had brought me to this point, to erase the very foundation that had shaped me. Okay, I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. I'll do whatever it takes, but I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to pretend I didn't build this company on my own terms. I know, Jennifer said. And that's what we're going to make sure people understand. This is your company, your success, no one else's. We hung up and I sat there in the silence of my office, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I couldn't help but feel a little lost. I had always known that success came with sacrifices, but this felt different. This felt like I was being asked to erase a part of myself, one that had been a significant part of my identity for years, but there was no turning back. The moment I had revealed my success, the moment I had let the truth slip out, the game had changed. Now it was time to face the consequences, to rise above the whispers, the doubts, and the expectations. I picked up my phone and sent a text to my parents. We need to talk. I have some things to discuss with you. As I pressed send, I realized that this moment, this turning point, wasn't just about my business. It was about reclaiming my narrative. I couldn't let anyone, not even my own family, rewrite my story. And I wasn't going to let them define me anymore. The conversation with my parents was inevitable. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but it had to happen. So when I arrived at their house a few days after my talk with Jennifer, I wasn't sure what I'd find. My parents were still processing everything, still struggling to reconcile the image of their daughter with the woman who had built a multi-million-dollar company. I wasn't sure if they'd ever fully accept me for who I was, or if they would always see me as a reflection of their own ambitions. When I stepped inside, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her gaze distant. She didn't look up when I walked in, but I could feel the weight of her silence. My father was nowhere to be seen, but I knew he'd be around soon. He always was. My mother was the more overt one in the family, but my father's judgments were often more biting, hidden beneath his polite smiles and carefully constructed words. Mom, I began softly, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. We need to talk. She set her coffee cup down and finally looked at me, her expression guarded but not unkind. I know, she said, her voice quiet. About what happened, about everything. I nodded. I don't want to pretend that I've been honest with you, or that you understand everything. But I'm not going to hide who I am anymore. I've worked for everything I have, and I'm not ashamed of it. She sighed, her eyes looking away for a moment, as though trying to find the right words. I never wanted you to hide, Mandy. I wanted things to be perfect for you. I wanted you to have everything I didn't. Mom, I said gently, you've given me so much. But I'm not you. I don't need the same things you did to feel successful. I don't need the luxury cars or the grand vacations. I need to be seen for who I am. Not for what I have, but for what I've built. There was a long pause before she spoke again. I never realized how much I held on to what I thought was success. I thought it was the only way to show you how much I cared, how much I wanted the best for you. I know you do, I said, my voice softening. But I've had to find my own way, my own version of success. She reached across the table, placing her hand on mine. It was a simple gesture, but for once, it felt genuine. I'm sorry, Mandy. I've always loved you, but I guess I never really saw you. I only saw the things that I thought mattered. I squeezed her hand, grateful for her acknowledgement, though I still wasn't sure how much had truly changed. It's not just about what I've achieved, Mom. It's about who I am. And I need you to see that. I need you to see me, not just the idea of me that you've built up in your mind. She nodded, her eyes misting with unshed tears. I'm trying, Mandy. I really am. Just then, my father walked into the room, his presence filling the space like it always did. He was dressed in his usual immaculate suit, his posture as perfect as ever. He looked at me, and I could see the mixture of pride and uncertainty in his eyes. It was the same look he'd had when I'd first started my business. Proud but hesitant, unsure of how to relate to me when I wasn't walking the path he'd envisioned for me. I think we need to talk too, he said, his voice more hesitant than I was used to hearing. I nodded, taking a deep breath. I agree, Dad. He sat down next to my mother, his hands folded in front of him as though he were about to deliver a speech. I'll admit, I've always had certain expectations for you, he began, his voice measured. I thought you were meant to follow the same path we did. The right schools, the right connections, the right career. I felt a pang in my chest as he spoke. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading. The moment when I'd hear the full weight of his disapproval, the judgment he'd kept hidden all these years. But, he continued, what I didn't see was that you've created your own path. You've done it your way, and that's something I can't ignore anymore. I blinked in surprise. Was this really happening? Was my father actually acknowledging my success? I'm proud of you, Mandy, he said, his voice firm. You've proven me wrong. I never thought you had it in you, but you've done more than I ever could have imagined. And for that, I owe you an apology. I felt a lump form in my throat, and I swallowed it down. I never needed you to think I was good enough, Dad. I needed you to see me as someone who didn't have to follow the same rules, someone who could create something of my own. And for a long time, I felt like I wasn't enough because I wasn't following your blueprint. But I am enough, and I've been proving that to myself every single day. My father looked at me for a long time, his eyes searching, as though he were finally seeing me for the first time. Slowly, he reached over and placed his hand on top of mine, a gesture that felt both new and foreign. I can't say that everything will change overnight, he said, his voice steady. But I'll try, Mandy. I'll try to see you for who you are and not just who I wanted you to be. I smiled, a genuine smile this time, and nodded. That's all I can ask for, Dad. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and I knew it wouldn't be. There would be moments of discomfort, moments when my parents, especially my father, would still slip into old habits. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally being seen. Not for what I had, not for the expectations they had placed on me, but for who I truly was. As I stood up to leave, my mother hugged me tightly, her arms wrapping around me in a way that felt different from all the other hugs we'd shared. This one was real. I'm proud of you, Mandy, she whispered, and I believed her. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, standing tall, true to myself, and finally beginning to heal the wounds that had been left open for far too long. 6 months had passed since that Thanksgiving dinner, and though the shift had been slow, it had been undeniable. My life, my relationships, my identity. Everything had changed. But more than that, I had changed. I had finally learned to stand firm in my truth, to embrace the success I had built, and to stop apologizing for who I was. Today, I was preparing for a meeting that felt different from all the others. This one wasn't about new investors or the next big partnership. This meeting was about solidifying my place in the world, not just as a CEO or a businesswoman, but as someone who had fought her way to the top on her own terms. The agenda was simple. I was meeting with the executives at Nexus Technologies to outline the future of the company and our mission. As I walked into the conference room, I couldn't help but smile. The team I had built, the people who had been with me since the early days of the company, were seated around the table. Jennifer, my loyal assistant turned business partner, sat at the head of the table, her usual calm demeanor radiating confidence. She had always believed in me, even when no one else did. "Good morning, everyone," I said as I walked in, taking a seat at the table. I could feel the energy in the room, the same energy I had worked so hard to cultivate over the years. A culture of respect, of shared values, of authenticity. It was a far cry from the world I had grown up in, where success was measured by possessions and status, not by purpose and connection. "Mandy," Jennifer said, her voice warm but professional, "we're ready to discuss the next phase, the expansion into the international market, the social impact initiatives. Everything is on track." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle in. There was so much we had accomplished, and so much more to do. But this time, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt empowering. I was no longer afraid of the challenges ahead. I had learned to embrace them, knowing that I could handle whatever came my way. "The next phase is about more than just growth," I began, my voice steady, filled with conviction. "It's about staying true to our mission. We've always been about helping small businesses, giving them the tools to compete in a corporate world that often leaves them behind. But we can do more. We need to do more." I glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of each person in the room. "I want us to focus on our social impact initiatives. I want to expand our tech education programs, create opportunities for young people in underserved communities, and help bridge the gap in digital equity. We've already made a difference, but we can make a bigger one." Jennifer smiled. "I love that direction, Mandy. And we've got the resources and the team to make it happen. I've already started reaching out to some nonprofit organizations that can help us." I felt a surge of pride as the team began discussing the logistics of the expansion. For the first time, the conversation wasn't just about profit margins or client acquisitions. It was about something more meaningful. It was about using our success to create real, lasting change. As the meeting progressed, I found myself reflecting on the path that had brought me here. There had been moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing, whether I was enough. But now I knew that my success was not just a product of hard work. It was a product of my authenticity. I had learned to be true to myself, to embrace my strengths and my flaws, to accept that my worth was not defined by the opinions of others. When the meeting wrapped up, I stood up and looked around the room. "Thank you, everyone. I'm proud of what we've accomplished together, and I'm excited for what's next. We've built something special here, and I know we'll continue to grow and make a difference." As I walked out of the room, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt before. There was no more tension in my chest, no more uncertainty about who I was or where I was headed. I was no longer hiding behind a facade, no longer trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine. I had created my own path, and I was walking it with confidence. Later that evening, I sat down to a quiet dinner in my home. A home that was still modest by some standards, but perfect for me. As I ate, I thought about the changes in my family dynamics over the past few months. They had come a long way, and I had too. My relationship with my parents was still a work in progress, but we were starting to understand each other. My father, in particular, had been trying, really trying, to see me for who I was, not who he wanted me to be. A text buzzed on my phone, interrupting my thoughts. It was from my mom. "I've been thinking about what you said, and I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I see you now, Mandy. I see the woman you've become." I smiled, a lump rising in my throat. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough. As I finished my dinner, I reflected on the journey I had taken to get here. It had been long and hard, full of challenges and obstacles. But through it all, I had learned the most important lesson of all. Success is not measured by the things you own, the car you drive, or the titles you hold. Success is about living authentically, about being true to yourself, and about using your voice to create change in the world. I looked out the window, the soft glow of the streetlights casting a warm light on the quiet neighborhood outside. For the first time in my life, I felt truly at peace. I had finally become the person I was always meant to be, the woman who didn't need anyone's approval to know her worth. And with that, I knew that the future was mine to shape, on my terms.